Organizations shape the world around us. It's time we shape them differently. Welcome to Orchestrate for Impact. I'm so excited about today's conversation. I think it's an essential one for anyone trying to navigate complexity and trace actions to impact. And to unlock that, we have to ask the question, how do we actually make sense of all the data in our organizations? How do we see it? How do we bring it together? And how do we use it to drive better decisions? As orchestrators, we're constantly working with information that's scattered across systems, teams, processes, and sometimes even more difficultly, it's inside of individuals. So data visualization is one of those tools that can help us turn all of the noise and the scattering into a clear picture. And sometimes that reveals patterns and highlights risks and opens up new possibilities that we never would have seen had we looked at one data set, one person, one story. Joining me today is Jackie O'Dowd, founding partner and CEO of Realizing Potential. Jackie and her team specialize in helping organizations untangle complexity. They connect dots between strategy, structure, people, processes, technology, and information, helping organizations see where they're misaligned and where they can work smarter. In this episode, Jackie shares how data visualization can help us see what we couldn't see before, have better conversations, and make more informed decisions. And one thing I love about this conversation is the fact that you can't take the human out of these moments. Enjoy. Welcome, Jackie, to Orchestrate for Impact. So happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk about data visualization.
This is the happy clap that we have when we get to talk about cool things with cool people. So let's dive right into it. When you say data visualization, what do you mean by that? And how did it come to be such a big part of
a big thing,
at least your current life?
It's about putting things in a graphical or pictorial format. We all get bombarded with lots of noise in text-based documents, spreadsheets, enterprise systems, and it's really hard to make sense of things. So the visualization for me just helps me make sense of something. Right. So my world is making sense of stuff, whether that's an enterprise architecture, merger and acquisition, doing expert opinion on legal cases. So, and all of those things usually involve large volumes of data or documents or whatever. So for me, the visualization is just about sense making, but it's sense making in context. So I've been heavily text-based for most of my life. I do have an IT and business background, so the two sort of meld. The data is the big connector for me. It's the narration of the organization.
Wow. And I guess with that, like, how does it, I hear storytelling, I guess, as connected to that narration part. So what does it take, do you think, for data to become more than numbers, more than just signals, or like, how does it become a story?
We take what I call structured or unstructured data. So things from enterprise systems or accounting systems, financial systems, transactional based data. We'll take those and then we'll say, how do we make sense of this? We'll take documents, which are usually, like if you think about regulation, a regulation document, they're hard work to read. When we visualize them, we can start to make sense. We can see the interweaves, the connection, the relationships between things. So it's about putting the data into a melting pot and visualizing it up so we can see different things. We start to look for patterns. We start to look for what's connected to what. How is it connected? What is the importance of that connection? Is it a one-to-one connection or is it one-to-many? What's important? What are the things that I'm looking for? So it's just, I always find when I take a clean data set, it's like, let me see the data, let me put it into context, and then let me fire questions at it. And for me, it helps me come up with better questions. Not always the answer, because you can
Interesting.
do different exploration and navigation from it, but you see different things. And I think when you visualize the data and you put it in a pictorial or a graph format, then when you've got a group of experts or subject matter experts or people who just do these things for a living and know a lot about it sitting around the table, they bring their perspective to the models and diagrams as well and say, that's missing. What does that mean? That actually doesn't connect in that way, or I didn't realize that happened in that way. So it's just a great starter of conversation and in some cases collaboration as well.
And I would imagine in these data sets that, especially from an enterprise point of view, this could be coming from all across the organization, from even different parts of the organization that don't perhaps in practice have such a strong interface. And so maybe sometimes maybe this data has never breathed the same air together, I guess, been brought together in particular ways.
Yeah, it's putting everybody on the same page, right?
Mm.
So, if you think about when we talk about an organization, well, we can think of it as a legal entity. You can think of it as a bunch of stuff that just comes together. You can think about it as a certain structure. So you've got divisions and departments and teams. You've got hierarchy, you've got formal structures, you've got informal structures. When we go into an organization, you're normally just given, here is an org chart, CEO at the top, layers down. You don't know where the knowledge sits. You can assume by role. You don't know who the super connectors are or how those roles even interact, because it's just a formal hierarchy. When you can see it in a different shape, lets you understand more. So if I can, I'll just show you what I mean.
Yes.
Okay, this is an organizational structure, right? So this is a health organization spread over multiple locations. So each one of those blue discs is a location. The yellow icons on that model are employees, people who are rated as an employee at different levels. We wanted to see what was the ratio of employees to managers. So the red little icons, little people icons, are managers. So very quickly, and this was all in an Excel spreadsheet. So when we were doing the due diligence on this M&A, we got a 60,000 line spreadsheet. That becomes very difficult to understand, question, and put into context. When you look at it like this, the due diligence said, so that region's bigger than that one. This region's got more managers than that one. Why is that? But the fascinating thing about this was they were able to see the dynamics of the organization. So the visualization helped to put that spreadsheet, which they had to make a decision on, in a better context for them. So we could see the regions, we could see the ratios, but more importantly, we could see what regions interact with others. You
Oh,
can't see
interesting.
that from the spreadsheet. So it's just a different way of looking. And one of the things that was fascinating for me in this particular model was over on the left-hand side, we could see a group of 5 employees that were not in a circle, right? So the way we
Oh,
brought
the
the
red.
data, the
There's
way
there's
we're
those
taking the data
red.
into the model, yeah, we can have one little red manager, and then we can see, we can see 5 people here. And it's just, why are they out on their own and not in a circle? Is that because that's the way the organizational structure has evolved? Is it by design? Or what? What is it? And it turns out that these people float between regions, so they backfill certain roles. But again, some of that was not visible from the spreadsheet. So it's a
Interesting.
way of telling it's a different way of telling the data story and for doing discovery and due diligence. So I won't click into any of this because there's actually some client data behind it. If we click on any one of the employees, it tells us who they are, what their employee number is, tells us about their role, tells us about their level of qualification and certification. It tells us about their tenure. It tells us about their annual leave. So from a due diligence or organizational discovery perspective, you can just click into the model and it takes you back to the core HR data. So we can
Mm.
answer questions, we can ask questions, and we can frame different exploration. So in this case, we were asked, well, how many of these employees and managers are actually full-time employed by the organization, and how many are employed on a contract basis? So then you can start to see, again, a different sort of dynamic. Now, why was that important? Why was that question important? Because they wanted to make sure if they went ahead with this acquisition, that the knowledge would be retained within the organization. With a high contractor base, it leaves the organization if it's not captured properly. So that's just one example of how you can see the complex interweave within the organization. You can see what are the important relationships and and in this case, we could work it out, who are the super connectors? So who are the
And
people
how,
who are working across the organization and across regions?
and I'm assuming in a merger situation, that's that's really useful then as you're forward planning in terms of how do you, I guess, take advantage of the relationships that exist and that social construct that's that's there. That's so interesting. You say that it wasn't in the spreadsheet, so to speak, or it wasn't perhaps visible in the spreadsheet. I guess, is this also bringing together other, like, lots of different data sets potentially to see some of this interconnection, or is it that it's that some of that data is sort of hidden? It's sort of a sub story perhaps in the data that's there, that because you visualize it, it's
Yeah,
actually bringing it to the surface.
yeah. When the spreadsheet was created, somebody did some nice formatting on it. They had hidden some columns. When we bring it in, we unhide those, right? Because all of the information we typically see is aggregated, distilled, or transformed, which is what happens in a spreadsheet. It's somebody's best idea of how that gets put together. When we open it up, then we say, well, what is that? We can hide things in the model because they are 3D interactive models. You can hide, you can trace, you can do all sorts of things. But the more data you have, the better the picture and the more data enabled decision making, effective decision making you can make.
I love that. And so this this is a snapshot of today, I guess, of the day that you got the data and where the data was sitting. And so that tells you, I guess, a bit of the current state.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you use the model then? Because it sounds like, in particular, this model was being used to help drive decision making, which makes sense. Are you able to then use it in a kind of creating potential different futures of what if it looked like this or what if it looked like that? Is there ways to kind of to show sort of how that decision making might make the model look different and what the ramifications of that might be?
Yeah, well, because there's an analysis engine as part of the platform, then you can start to look at things like, what if this particular role was removed? What's the impact? Or if we made this change, what is the probability? You can start to do some mathematical calculations around the data as well. What it doesn't do, because I don't think even as humans we're good at it, is prediction, right?
Yeah.
The data, we can do some really good probability stats, but prediction, no, we'll leave that to Nostradamus.
Oh, darn. For all of the listeners, wishing that maybe you were about to put the secret unlocking on a platter, Jackie.
No,
You mean
unfortunately not.
decision making is still human?
It is. And,
Interesting.
whilst, we're using the technology to visualize the data, this really is about the human in front of the model. What do they see? How do they interpret it? What's important for them? Because everybody will see different things in these models. Now, I will look at it very differently to how you see it.
I think that's the fascinating thing about how, I guess, a multifaceted data set, especially in a spreadsheet, and almost those different stories that you might tell, perhaps based on, as you were saying earlier, the questions that you had, or the questions that you are exploring or wanting to make decisions on, or to build confidence around particular decisions. And as a qualitative researcher, I'm really fascinated on how does the quantified data with the qualitative kind of come together in this. And obviously we can make qualitative data more quantitative in some of its forms. But I'm curious about, I guess, that dynamic of, this shows you maybe there's something happening, but then how do we dive into I guess the why? Like, why do you have those outliers? Why are those reds outside the circle?
All of that, right? The quantitative data is, how many have we got? Right? Where are they? The quantitative data is, what's the value of that role in that region for this business? And is that a tangible value or an intangible value? So is it something that appears on the balance sheet, or is it something that adds to our organizational capability? If we have numerical data, then we can also show that. So, because this is a graph model, the little icons are nodes and the lines between them are edges. And we can apply data to both of them if we have it. So it depends what you want to see in the data story, right? My thing is, what are we trying to do here? Are we exploring, doing a discovery, or are we explaining?
Interesting. Tell me
Because
more about that difference for you.
for me, the exploring is, we have all of this data. We don't really know what we've got because it's been siloed, or it typically is siloed. A piece is in a HR system, some is in a CRM system, some is in a enterprise system, some is in spreadsheets, whatever it happens to be. And so we typically only look through the lens of what do I need to see from that system. When we combine the data sets, we get a more holistic view. So we can take elements of data from one, so HR, we can take some from finance, which is cost. So in this case, how much have we spent on training at that region in the last year? And then we can say what dollar value per individual and on what. So we can then start to quantify and shape and bring other factors into the things we're exploring. They may not be set questions, but you can navigate through the model, through the data to start asking those sort of questions. The other side of that is when we come to do explaining is this is what this organization looks like. We have so many regions, we have so many employees. We can do certain things, right? So we can say, how many divisions have we got? And we can then start to highlight things in the model, and you can talk about and explain what they actually are to those that don't know or are not sure.
Because organizations is you were describing, sort of, there's lots of different ways, I guess, to describe what an organization is, but a lot of it is intangible, unseen, or super conceptual. It's not, even if those things, those intangible things are even rigid, they're hard to see sometimes, I guess, in just the everyday.
Yeah. And every day, most people will look at certain KPIs. They will have dashboards presented to them. And that's where I say the information that they're looking at is aggregated, distilled, or personalized. I only want to see everything that is coming off the rails. I only want to see everything that has a risk associated with it. So we start to sort of distill that information ourselves. When we're looking at data in this way, you can still take a distilled or aggregated view. But the thing that I like about it is it takes some of those organizational blinkers off, and it lets us start to look at things from a holistic view. What happens when the pieces all come together? Like, you think of the average manager or leader in an organization, they have 30, 40, 50 different priorities, and everybody pushing for space and everybody looking for resourcing. Unless you can get that view of what does that all mean, the prioritization gets a little bit out of kilter. Whoever screams the loudest or makes the most noise tends to get the resource allocation. We tend to, whilst we're mixing all of that together, we start to miss things like emerging patterns or weak signals that's in the data that we have, but we just don't go looking for because we say we don't have time, or that's not a view I typically take.
And in, I guess, those instances, it almost becomes emergent to people if you create the right conditions for that to, I guess, be seen.
Yeah.
Can you tell me how, I guess, what are the times and places that are really opportune for organizations? And I guess I would think about orchestrators in organizations wanting to actually, like, what's that spark for them where they go, we need this data visualization, and perhaps maybe they're coming to you with we have a question rather than we know exactly what we need. What is it particularly good at approaching or unlocking for organizations?
I think the sense making, for one, is me. I look at it in two buckets. things. One is research, right? As an orchestrator, as a change agent, what can I do? What do I need to know? What do I need to understand? What am I trying to influence? What am I trying to change? What am I trying to get a result on? Where do I want to be more impactful? All of those things. Everybody has data. So how do I use that data and leverage it? Right. So I'm just going to share and show you hopefully another model, which is a different type. Right. So right now, the whole world is focused on supply chains and looking at vulnerability and how we do things better in the case of circularity, sustainability, environmental, all that ESG stuff. This is a model we put together, which is based on the Kwinana Industrial Complex in Western Australia. So it shows the materials and commodities exchange that happens within that industrial complex. So we can start to see, we've got quantified data. We can say who has relationships with whom. What are the commodities that are in play? So we can see the materials, we can see who the sellers are, we can see who the buyers are, we can see the impact if one organization decides it's going to change. So in this case, BHP was looking to close this facility down for a period of time. The complex needed to understand the impact. As orchestrators within organizations, we know we're going to deal with change every day. Things come out of left field. We concentrate on our organization, what we know. But a lot of the change is driven from outside of our own organizational boundary. So what does that mean? So by looking at the data that you have, you can start to look at it in certain ways. You can trace things. You can say, what if? You can say, oh my God, I didn't realize that. Or if that supply is impacted by the new tariff regime out of the USA, what does that actually mean to my supply chain? So it's just, it's bringing things together. It's looking for the connections. It's looking for the patterns. It's looking for trends. It's looking for things that are impacting our organizations that we sometimes don't think enough about. In this case, we started saying, what is the vulnerability in this industrial precinct in that case? It's data they already have. And as a group, the hardest thing was to actually get all the organizations within the precinct to actually be open to sharing the data. And as orchestrators, we need to put the rules, the boundaries, the governance frame in place to make sure that the data we have and the data we show and the data we share is good for that purpose. So that just,
that's a deeply relational human layer to this.
Yeah. Like it's who is important in this? What is important in this? It's just a great way to start saying, what does this mean? What is important to us today? What is going to be important for us tomorrow based on where we are on our resilience journey, sustainability journey, ESG? So one of the big things out of all of this, which was a byproduct of this, was how do we monitor emissions out of all of this? How does this trade impact our emissions profile?
And I think that's one of the big things I'm exploring with Orchestrate for Impact is that translation from these massive societal impacts that we're hoping to positively contribute to rather than negatively contribute to, and then backing that up into, well, how does that actually break down into the smaller everyday decisions and actions that we're making in and around our own organization? So I could imagine something like this where you've got this huge circle of so many different players and so many intersections into the, I guess, that supply chain, and thinking about that even inside an organization to be able to say, do you know when you decide to do this versus that in your everyday work, what that's the through line of that, even though in and of itself it might be small and you might not even think of it as consequential at all. I think that's that interesting meaning making that you could bring to this, right? Where you can say, well, did you know that when you do this, or when you set yourselves up to do things in a particular way, did you already know that you're helping to contribute to, a better outcome? And maybe some people, that's just naturally how they are, but they're not doing it because that's their values maybe, or that's just the way they do business and they're not thinking about that. But for those, I would imagine, especially in the ESG space where there's a lot more accountability around the role that each organization is playing, I think that storytelling, to be able to translate that into, you can do a lot of reports, but if you're actually not changing how you're functioning or how you're buying or how you're
I
or you're
mean,
manufacturing,
this
it's not
just,
going to do anything.
no, this just sets, I mean, the thing that I like about Kwinana and what they're doing, and that whole Kwinana industrial area is doing an amazing job because they brought together a whole heap of large corporates. They've decided they want to work better together. They want a better impact on their environment. So they are tracking their emissions and their reporting. They also have a huge stakeholder group, government, the local communities, as well as themselves, the regulators. There's a whole interplay here. The other key thing is then the provision of services, because all of these organizations in that precinct use energy and use water. They use ports, they use rail. So collectively, how do they influence the provision of that infrastructure? And they can't really, when they have a model like this, they can start to have those conversations about, well, what does that mean? What is the impact? What investment do we need? How do we best fit compliance and regulation? And who's involved? We can look at spreadsheets, we can look at reports, we can make sense of them. But when we show data and present it in this way, it just opens up a whole different type of conversation.
In the mental model, I would imagine, I would love to be in the room when you show this to people for the first time, when you bring a sensing and a seeing of something they live and breathe every day.
We can get one of two reactions.
What are those reactions?
Sometimes it can be, oh, wow. And others, it can be frightening.
And why frightening?
Because sometimes when you visualize data in a certain way, it can expose things that people didn't want others to see. So, if you think about financial data, when you start to model financial data, then you can start to see where there is some sort of fraudulent or illegal activity, which has happened before. You can see problems in processes and information flow that maybe is unhelpful when you're being held to account. So it can be frightening. But the majority of the time, I'm pleased to say, is people just go, I didn't know that. Or I'm now seeing things and considering things that I hadn't seen or considered before.
And as you're contrasting that, it makes me wonder about what are the other, I guess, conditions or capabilities or I guess cultural infrastructure that needs to be in place for data visualization to in its ideal in I guess the most ideal way to be successful and to be impactful, I guess, no matter what it's conveying. I'm curious around in your experience into all these different types of organizations and different moments of amazing or shut it down. Are there some core things that you've noticed that organizations that have these types of things in place really get the most out of this?
I mean, these technologies, this particular technology is reasonably new, right? So right now we're in the wow phase. We've used it on legal projects for discovery to explore hundreds of thousands of documents are part of a very big claim. We've used it in mining organizations to look at the license to operate and approvals process. That was probably one of the most interesting reactions that I've had, saying, we don't want to know this. And my answer was, you need to know this. So that comes back to that distillation. So for me, the starting point is obviously data, because that's what we're visualizing. I think we need people with a form of systems thinking that get relationships and context and connection, and somebody who can explain and wants to explore that, right? Because these models are done for a reason. They're for communication. So it's about having people and the capability within the business to be able to do that. I think a lot of it is about good decision making and people understanding what it takes to get to a good decision. I don't think everybody probably knows or works through that. And for me, the most important thing is a really high level of curiosity. Right? You know, what is, what can be, what opportunity is there? You know, typically we look at data to tell us what is, what's good, what's bad, but it also hides our blind spots. So when we visualize this, we can start to work out what our blind spots actually are. And if you've got a facilitator, an orchestrator, who can say, what are the priorities? You know, are we on strategy? Are our business processes optimized in the same way? Is our data and information flowing to the people that need it when they need it? Do we have the right governance frame? And how do we bring data in so all of our people are on the same page? We're all working to the same drumbeat. I think that's what I like to see in businesses, and some of the businesses we work with get it from day one. Others need a bit of help to get there. And there's nothing wrong in that because we're all at different maturity levels. But I just think, you know, it's using the data and information that you've got to maximum effect.
And do you see, I guess, obviously sometimes we would be doing this type of exploration or discovery as either a one-off or something has sparked us and now we want to find means to better understand what is and where we want to go. I think sometimes that can be treated almost like as a project, or it's this moment in time and then we're going to go back and move on into how we work. I guess with the idea that the technology that you're working with is quite new and is being explored and applied, I guess, do you have sort of a nirvana state for some of this in terms of how does this get used in just that sensing and knowing and that feedback of reflective practice as an ongoing, I guess, capacity within an organization?
Yeah. We recently worked on a model with a sales organization, right? They were curious about their sales. This is something every business needs. Every business needs to make money. So they had a multinational sales team. They had one central CRM system, but they couldn't see the relationships between salespeople across regions, who was working with the same client, who was writing proposals. So you've got some salespeople writing proposals for one product for one client and somebody writing a proposal for another product for the same client. And so you would think that this thing would be obvious, but it wasn't for them. So such a simple thing was taking the CRM data and looking at the number of proposals by salesperson for each client. But the really obvious thing was when we modeled the data, which wasn't obvious from looking at the CRM itself, was how many proposals were started, never finished, never linked or sent to a client. Simple, little things. And you go, why is that? Why? We've got all of this noise in the system. And then we go back to the KPIs that say the salespeople are incentivized for the number of proposals that were created, not the number of proposals that were actually accepted. So you could link it back to the metric system. They're just,
You're incentivizing
simple.
in the wrong way.
Exactly. So when we're orchestrating the organization and we're designing these reward and recognition systems, are we recognizing and rewarding the right things? Because we've got a CRM system over here that is just choked with noise. And at some point, the data is meaningless and irrelevant that's in that system. So we're paying for storage space, user licenses, manipulation of that data. It's all got a cost to the business.
So many knock-on effects of just seeing that people seem busy and maybe they are busy, not on the right things or not on the most effective things. That's fascinating. And I guess that must have been quite eye-opening for that client to see the dynamic in play.
Yeah, it was. And so you can use it in a simple one-off look to see what is the state of the nation today. You can use it with real-time data feeds into the models. So if this is your bent, right? And this is a thing in finance industries, let's look, where is the fraudulent activity? What is looking, let's say, not true as against true? You can start to see patterns and movements and anomalies in real time as well as one-off. It depends what you want to do with your data. But every business has it, right? Some will have small data sets, others will have terabytes of data. It's how we use the data in a better way to drive the outcomes and the projects that we're all trying to do every day. It's just using it in a better way.
And I can imagine to the blind spots that you were mentioning before, it starts to show what we don't know. And when we say we care about particular things, but we have no way of knowing, perhaps that starts to give direction to the organization to go, let's start finding ways to create data or capture data that can give us signals about that. Because I think that that's also in data for data's sake isn't really getting us anywhere. It's what do we care about?
And that's what this is, right? So this is the European Union Artificial Intelligence Regulation. Everyone today, every organization is looking to use AI, or is using AI, or is embedding it, or is planning to do it. And there's a whole heap of regulation that is there to guide. And so we modeled out what the act actually looks like and how complicated it is. So what are the chances of every organization who is going down that path understanding the complexity of compliance? How many organizations are involved just in this one act alone? There are something like 18 to 20 directives. Does anybody go and drill down into the directive? No, but a risk manager might. To read the act, it's hundreds of pages of mind-numbing detail. When you visualize it like this, you can say, okay, I have to think about benchmarking. So I know there's some benchmarking in it. I know that I have to do some sort of development deployment assessment. It just helps you make sense and navigate things that impact our business every day. EU regulation for the artificial intelligence. This could just as easily be a finance regulation or a quality standard. It's about getting people to understand and explore it and be able to do something with it.
I just was having this thought of imagine that if regulators or policy creators actually thought about the visualization of all the interconnectedness before they deployed these things as a way to examine and test to make sure that even what they're putting out actually hangs together. Because sometimes there's so much fallout from these complicated, and there's good intention in the complication. It's just that in the reality of actually embodying that and embedding it, we can feel good that, yes, there's regulation, but if people can't follow it and people can't bring that to life and people can't live it, or organizations can't follow it, then we're all pretending that we're in a controlled and safe space.
But what happens when they clash? When you've got two pieces of regulation that clash? What action do you take? What steps do you take?
Oh, I love that.
At least when you
Yes.
can see it and you can work it through. And if you've got those two pieces that the human says, I think these clash. I'm not so sure, but I think they clash. Model both of them together and overlay them and see where they clash. It's using the tools that we have available to help us analyze things, to recognize things, and to see the blind spots. I would hazard a guess that the majority of organizations that are deploying technologies like AI today wouldn't know where and how and when they comply with regulation, legislation, compliance frames.
It is going to be the Wild West for a little while. I have a feeling.
Yeah, and look, I'm just picking on AI because I've modelled out the
No, I
regulation,
love
but it
it.
could be anything. But it
It
could
could
be
be
anything.
anything.
It
Yeah.
could be
Yeah.
anything. This could be your own policy frame where you say, where is our policy deficient? Where does it need to be updated? Where has it outlived its usefulness? You can when you start to see it, you see different things. It prompts different things for you. So for blind spots, for navigating really complex, wicked problems, this sort of technology, this sort of data visualization is just such a great tool to use. And
I
we
can
all use
imagine
data
that.
every day.
And I can imagine that the more and more you're doing this, the more and more patterns you're seeing in similar types of data sets where you can almost bring interpretation to the dynamics, because it's almost like this meta data set of meaning that you can start to create and go, if we're trying to create these types of dynamics, I see smoke over here, I see smoke over here. Usually when we see those types of smoke and this type of pattern, it usually means this type of a thing.
Yeah.
And it's these types of responses. So I could imagine, I guess, the meaning making becomes even more and more powerful. And that's the human side of going, well, what does this mean and what should we do because of it? And so I think your clients are very lucky to have someone like you to be taking them on that journey from spreadsheets to insight to action, which I think it's such a, I think a lot of organizations are really looking for a guide through that complexity.
And the thing is, everybody needs to do it in a quicker way, right? They don't always have the time they don't have weeks to pull this stuff together, because some of the decisions they're making or need to happen like within a day, within an hour, whatever that is. If they can try and use their data to give them better visibility, get to some form of better understanding and insight, then I think they're steps ahead. The risk and the vulnerability is less when you've done a little bit of navigation through the data that you've got. Because all too often, it's provided in dashboards, it's provided in spreadsheets, and unless you actually go and check the formulas in that spreadsheet, the formatting, what's been hidden, what hasn't, how do you know what the true story of your organization is? And this is where I think orchestrators and change managers within the business, if they can see the business in this sort of way, they're not just looking at post-it notes on a wall with great ideas. This is actually what has happened, and this is what could happen, or if we just want to explore one thing, like doing the trace when we were taking one organizational change through an industrial complex, who was impacted and what did it mean? Then if we can do that, even on a small piece within an organization, I think it's just value for money.
And people need that light. They need something to move through the growing complexity that's coming their way.
Yeah. And, we did a project a little while ago for a retailer who said, we have got fantastic reporting, is great, retail data is all the metrics, everything's looking really good, but we'd be curious for you to model our data and tell us something we didn't know. Right? This was the challenge. So this was a fun exercise for them. Did they have to do it? No. I just love this management team because they think outside the box. So we took their point of sale data. It's petroleum retail. So when people go into a service station, they will typically buy their petrol, but then they'll buy something else. Sometimes it'll be a coffee, sometimes it'll be cigarettes, sometimes it'll be snacking things, sometimes it'll be a bar of chocolate, whatever it is. Right? And so what we did when we modeled the data was we said, okay, every time somebody buys diesel fuel, they buy a coffee, but they also buy a Kransky sausage. Now, up until then, I didn't even know what a Kransky sausage was. But,
They're very good.
and so I've never had a Kransky sausage, but we could see that at certain times of the day, those were the things that went together. Now, in the store, one was over there, one was over there, and the fuel was obviously charged through the pump. So what they did was they said, well, between that hour and that hour, we're going to bring these together. So the steps are less, the time spent on serving the client is shortened. So they picked up small efficiency gains by looking at what was sold, when it was sold, how it was sold. Now, they knew their sales. They knew they sold Kransky sausages. They knew they sold coffee. They knew they sold diesel, but they didn't know when they went together and how often they went together. So what do you want to see in your data? Something that is interesting. Like what happens, in the case of the merger and acquisition, what happens if you do not manage to retain your super connectors? If those people become unsettled at the time of that transaction and they decide to leave, does your investment get impacted? Absolutely, it does.
And so it's seeing between the data as well to make sure you're making the right decisions.
Yeah. Well, you can, when they got the spreadsheet, they said, oh, we've got 6,000 employees across these locations, these qualifications, this outstanding liability. That's fantastic. But we're talking about now a transaction that is going to change your business. You now need to bring two businesses together. So how does your current organizational structure and this new one come together? How are they the same and how are they different? And who are your super connectors on both parts?
And I could imagine how that would also then augment the on-the-ground engagement that they have with the people in those businesses and the people working in those businesses to create clarity for them as well, because that would be insight that wouldn't be known by the people working either. So I think that it's interesting how it can keep working and weaving back into that knowledge, creates a different kind of engagement, a different kind of shared understanding of what you're actually dealing with. Oh my goodness, Jackie, there's so much more we could be talking about. I'm like, let's go through every example of how we could use this because it's just fascinating.
I mean, I live and breathe this stuff every day. I just think that we're in such an exciting time now in organizational development, using data to really achieve impactful, sustainable change. We've now got we've just got new tools, new ways of doing things. And if we're going to foster really good, knowledge-based organizational cultures, got to start with data.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time, Jackie. And I hope everybody starts to think about
You're
what
more
data
than welcome.
they're sitting on.
Loved it.
Let's bring it to life. Amazing.
Let's say
Thank
power
you.
to the orchestrators. Thanks.
Thanks.